either live by the gun or you die by the sword.
Welcome to The Good, the Bad, and the Weird. I'm Nico.
And I'm Chris.
And today, we are combining two of our greatest interests. Movies and true crime.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit different today. And on top of that, we are reviewing our first documentary.
True and proper documentary.
Yes. And, I mean, we had talked about doing a documentary for quite a while.
Yeah.
But
I love a documentary. But, they don't play by the same rules.
They don't, and I mean, I'd gone through a little bit of a phase where, I'd just load up a documentary when I got home from work and just went about 2 months of that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a lot of people's standard. Those of us who, watch them regularly feel like it's a small bubble of, yeah, that's one of my favorite types of things to watch. Just a documentary.
Yeah, and I mean, so mine kind of started tapering out when I started listening to podcasts.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of podcasts have replaced that niche.
Yeah, just because they kind of fulfill the same thing without the visuals.
Yes, and I think also we've kind of gotten into a weird place where documentaries have become very quick and easy to make, which they've always been budget-wise different than movies. Let's be very true about that.
Yeah.
But we've gotten to a point where, especially with the rise of YouTube and podcasts, you can throw out a documentary, a fairly well-edited and put together one, quick and dirty.
Yeah. Well,
so I feel like we've lost kind of the having to dig through a pile of garbage documentaries to find that one good one.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think there was this little bit of phase where, I think it was after Shane Dawson did, one true crime one, and then everyone started putting a documentary on every single video, even if it was, a 15-minute one, and it's technically, yes, but not in the same viewpoint.
Yes, and then we also got, those of us who liked documentaries also kind of got burned back in the day by Animal Planet and the Discovery Channel.
Yes.
And the History Channel.
Yes, which I did want to get into that in just a wee bit.
Definitely.
Because we also kind of wanted to use this as kind of an introductory dive into kind of the framing and storytelling of documentaries.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it is...
It's its own thing. And
for the most part, it kind of, for at least me, generated around true crime, unsolved mysteries kind of things,
Oh yeah, I feel like once you find your interest in documentaries and you have time to peruse that selection, it becomes easier for you to figure out what type of documentary you like, and then it's easier to branch off into other subject matters. But boy, finding a good one to get started on and get that interest rolling can be kind of hard. Yeah,
no, I completely agree with that. I mean, I've watched documentaries that I was not remotely interested in, but it was just kind of oh, all right, kind of interesting, and then just moved on to the next thing.
Or the one that always burns me the most is you find a subject that you're interested in, you go to watch this documentary about it, and you're like, this is going to be it. This one looks like it's going to be everything that I could want, and it's going to fulfill all my knowledge-based questions, and it does the opposite.
Yeah, and I mean, that's exactly what happened with us, because well, what documentary are we doing today, Chris?
We're reviewing Tales of the Grim Sleeper.
Yes, because this is one that there's getting a little bit more attention to it, but it's still kind of one of those sleeper.
Yeah, it definitely flew under the radar.
Serial killers.
Yeah, and this is a serial killer the Grim Sleeper, that is, who he gets brought up in conjunction with other serial killers.
Yes.
Which is, I think, kind of a two-part problem. We've become kind of, especially with the rise of the true crime world and the attention that's brought, there's now kind of a shift of you need the next biggest thing.
Yeah.
And while the things he did were heinous and truly just, they shook the neighborhood and community he was in, they weren't quote-unquote special enough to get him into that elite top section.
He wasn't one of the heavy hitters. He wasn't with even though his body counts were similar, he still doesn't get the notoriety Gacy, Bundy, or Kemper do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the attention he doesn't get, I'll actually get into in a little bit.
Yeah, because there's a couple of reasons why.
Mm-hmm. And also just the way we're doing this review is going to be different than our previous ones. It's not really a scene by scene because documentaries are so interwoven and they don't really have like it cuts back and forth between stuff so quickly. We kind of have to make generalizations of a lot of information. And
before we really get into it, I quickly want to go over what to me qualifies a good documentary.
Yes. And I do want to get into that, but I also want to go through like a quick history onto what's led to our modern documentaries.
Definitely,
yes.
Because they are different.
Yes. And before that, Tales of the Grim Sleeper, for those who haven't seen it or are unaware of it, it's a 2014 documentary about the serial killer Lonnie David Franklin Jr., who was given the name Grim Sleeper due to an apparent break-in killing spree. It is written and directed by Nick Broomfield, Barney Broomfield, and Mark Hofferlin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And just a quick documentary note, because again, this is our first true one.
Mm-hmm.
When we say written and directed, Nick's the guy that you're going to see asking all the questions. He's going to be the person in the front of the camera. Yeah,
he's also the narrator.
Exactly.
But they're all kind of working together. Some are doing sound, some are doing... They're all working in tangent.
And some documentaries are... especially modern ones, are shot a little bit more like a movie. This one fits more into a more traditional definition of a documentary. Mm-hmm. They are just going around asking people questions.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting take because, as we'll get into it, there's a lot of different ways you can do a documentary, even though it doesn't feel like there should be.
Exactly. And so before we get into, in our opinion, what makes a good documentary, I do want to go over like a brief overview of the timeline that's led to our documentaries because it has changed.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Because one important thing of note is that documentaries are supposed to be, or originally, nonfiction films that stem from the birth of cinema. They're they're probably the oldest type of cinema out there.
Oh, definitely.
But they kind of petered out early on in favor of fictional films after 1908. But it was revitalized in the 1930s by the British documentary movement.
Yes.
Also, I do want to note my notes for the history is the film book, A Complete Guide to World Movies. It's a very short snippet too, and of course Wikipedia, but...
Our favorite.
Yes. And then by the First World War, documentaries became somewhat synonymous with propaganda.
Yes, they did.
For a while, and we still have that little... issue with them, and it doesn't just pertain to one side or the other. Both sides are heavily used it. We do briefly mention this in our Different from the Others episode about German film history.
Yeah.
And then documentaries have also gone through a variety of changes in styles, which, again, to go into in detail is a whole other episode.
For sure.
But to give the brief synopsis is that in general, in the 1930s, Western European and U.S. documentaries were focused on social and environmental issues, but still continue to this day.
They're popular topics.
And then in the 50s, there was a slew of short series describing the working class life from the free cinema movement in England, which was associated with the cinema verite, which was a movement that was geared more towards a realistic picture, a pure picture without artistic and artificial effects.
Yes, and that movement, you can still find, those examples are free on YouTube for a lot of the time, and they weirdly blend into like infomercial world.
Yeah.
Which is fun and fascinating, but also kind of is part of the reason why the definition of documentaries has become so weird, because we watch those and we do not see them as documentaries.
Yeah.
But at the time, that's what they were. We watch them now and we think, wow, what a weird narrative on house life.
Yeah, because then we also get like Gonzo style, and it's a very realistic, but it's also kind of warped because it's from the person who's heavily involved in the community. Yeah, and so from this, then from the 60s to today, documentaries are more narrative driven.
Very.
And lean more towards investigative exposés and historical investigations, of which the Grim Sleeper kind of falls in this weird middle ground because we are kind of in the middle of like learning about everything that's going around it.
Yes, and that's one of the things why I liked this documentary especially, was because it took itself knowing that the questions and people that it was going to introduce in the film were going to be important historical later.
Yeah.
But right now, this is current. And it still feels current. It is still current. It was in 2014 that this came out.
Oh, yeah. And I'm going to go into that a little bit, because there is a reason why it's still even more so current than just this documentary came out in 2014. But before we get into any of that, what makes a good documentary, Chris?
So,
or at least to you.
So to me, and this is personal taste, because again, especially with modern documentaries, there is a slew of different styles, and that includes editing choices, that includes narrative style choices, that includes what the subject matter is to an extent.
Yes.
But to me, the story is number one. And when I say story, whether or not you like it, all documentaries are shot through a lens. None of them are going to give you the perfect truth. They're going to try and do their best to give you that. That's another sign of a good documentary, is there shouldn't be obvious wrongs from the narrator. Now, the people they interview, they're people. They're going to tell you what their experience was or how they remember it. But the narrator and the story that the thing is trying to give should be as truthful as possible while also remaining interesting.
Yeah.
Editing is another big flag for me on whether or not this is going to be worthwhile. I've watched a lot of documentaries where it is mostly voiceover over a picture. Don't get me wrong, the pictures are necessary. An entire documentary with no still images kind of hurts my brain.
Yeah.
But if it's just a guy talking over it, YouTube is very notorious for creating these. They might have good information, but you can't expect your audience to be captured long enough to really take any of that in.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that I think is really important, at least to make it a really good documentary, is that it needs to be taking a perspective for an audience member who's already somewhat knowledgeable about the story. I don't think documentaries that spend the entire documentary explaining the most basic concept to you, I don't think those are helpful.
Well,
and let me give an example.
Yeah, okay.
So, an example would be like this movie. Good example. This movie does give a quick, brief overview of who this man was, who Franklin is, what he did, what the facts that the police have are, and then we move on to the side of the story that we hadn't heard before, which is what his neighbors thought of him, what his ex-girlfriend thought of him, what his son thinks of him, which is important and new information. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, I do have a different viewpoint on documentaries. I just want what makes a good documentary to me is, I guess I'm very old school. Did I learn something from it?
Sure.
Was it interesting? Like, for me, I watched a documentary around the same time Baby Metal was becoming really big, and my buddy Sugi was posting a lot about it. And so I watched this documentary, I think it was just called Idol Culture.
Oh, yeah.
Just specifically about idol culture, because I was trying to understand it. I don't fully grasp it, but
there's a lot to go.
There is. And I mean, but it was informative, and it's like, okay, I do get some of this, some of it's sweet, some of it is very creepy.
Yes.
But at least I was learning. And I think that's another thing about documentaries is you have to be learning something new. And I think that's where like edutainment has come in. Specifically, I tried listening to a handful of podcasts. Biggest one that contributed was Last Podcast on the Left, obviously, for obvious reasons.
Course.
One of the earlier ones. Not that they need any shouting out. But then you at least started it. I listened to the whole thing. The Spotify original Serial Killers, such a creative name, and it is so scripted and boring. And that's the thing that also makes...
The story is bland.
Yeah, exactly. The story of it, because that's what makes good documentaries, is it keeps you interested, and that's the other thing, is that it doesn't feel heavily scripted.
Yes.
And that's where the hard line between propaganda and blatant propaganda and good documentary work happens. Like, not necessarily documentary, but I know we've talked about it. I can't remember the actual name of it. It's the one where it's Beware the Ever-Present Homosexual.
I know exactly which one you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes. It's right up there with Women. Know Your Place.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I know exactly which one you're talking about.
Yeah, where it's set up to be almost, it's very propaganda.
It is. It's supposed to influence you to a point that's unrealistic for just providing information.
Yeah.
The other thing that is really hard to judge, and unfortunately for this one, I don't have a way to go back and verify. One of the things I really like to do, especially with the more mainstream entertainment style, quote-unquote, documentaries, and there's a lot of those out right now. A lot of them have to do with pop culture, with niche fashion trends, with other countries, like niches and interests like J-fashion, pop culture, street fashion. All of these ones have been in some way portrayed on mainstream media. And one of the things that I really like to do is, it's not hard, especially if something has gone wrong, to go back and find the people that were interviewed that were supposed to be representing that thing.
Yeah.
And discover that the editing process took their words and incorrectly portrayed it.
Yeah, it's like reality TV, and why I can't stand to watch it because it's so heavily edited and obnoxious. And,
yes.
And not differently too.
Edited in a way.
American reality TV, because British reality TV is a whole other thing, and it is watchable.
It is. British documentaries that are on public TV are just as bad as Americans, is what I found.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of the things that are going on is the documentary makers are coming in with a preconceived notion of what the thing is, which is good. You need to start somewhere, especially as the writer of this. You shouldn't go in blind. That's silly. But they're coming in with a preconceived notion, and when the people they are interviewing that are part of that thing tell them, no, you're not quite right, this is the other thing, and they edit that to make their story correct, that is, to me, a huge red flag. But it is really hard to prove. Yeah,
but in a way that almost stems from how we've talked about the Victorian era, just making up whatever the fuck they feel like.
Yes, and especially with these big mainstream ones, it has become a lot easier to go onto YouTube or on blogs and find the people who were interviewed for that and have them then either review the thing themselves or come out and say, well, they had this part right, this part is wrong, or no, they butchered my words completely. That's not how that was filmed. That's not how they said it was going to be. Unfortunately, with this particular documentary, we don't have that luxury. A lot of these people, I can't find any additional quotes from.
Because this is the only time they've been interviewed in regards to this information.
Exactly. Which is important that they were at all. That's huge. And for a lot of documentaries, good documentaries, that's important. But it is a weird back-checking problem that documentaries are now starting to have to face. Yes,
and also we do have to not trying to dismiss any of their experiences.
No.
But eyewitness reports are highly unreliable, especially years after it happens.
Oh, for sure.
Because you can easily just okay, well, that makes sense, and you can start making not necessarily a false memory, but an altered memory.
Oh, for sure. And again, people's perspectives are their own. And to them, that is the reality. And that's what's nice about documentaries. But something that we've started to see crop up, especially with ones that are about true crime and about cases that, while the police may say is solved, probably are not fully solved.
Oh, yeah.
This one especially not fully solved at all.
Yeah, especially the era it took place in.
Very much so. And the location and everything. It is important that we record those memories and have those interviews and have those talks with those people, but we also have to keep in mind that they are people. Yeah. And they are experiencing the world through their own eyes and through their own experiences. And that's something that documentaries now are having to deal with more so than I think any other time in the history. Yeah. Because now it's easy for people, or so they think, to do some armchair researching and be like, no, that date is wrong, that time is wrong, that color is wrong.
Yeah, it's like going back and watching Know Your Enemy Japan and realizing this is completely way off.
Yeah.
I mean, it's propaganda, and that's what it was. It was meant to create an enemy out of a human, because that's the first thing you do. Well, it's a whole other rabbit hole.
Yes, it's a different rabbit hole.
I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, it is a hard thing to nail down, and like what makes, like, any movie or any media format, what makes something good for one person doesn't translate to another person.
Yes.
As people have mentioned who have reached out to me from our podcast, that they like that we're different, and we have different views on everything at the end of the day. So
of course.
So before we really get into the movie or the documentary, who was Lonnie D. Franklin Jr.? Lonnie D. Franklin Jr., better known to the public outside of his neighborhood as the Grim Sleeper, was a serial killer who operated, as far as we know, between 1985 and 2007. Yep. And that's part of the reason why it feels so fresh, is because we were still in high school when some of this stuff was going down, and we didn't know this. Yeah. We do know that he was responsible for the rape and murder of at least 10 victims, but the span of his crimes was most likely far exceeded that. For reasons we'll get into later on in the documentary.
Definitely.
Why he received the moniker of the Grim Sleeper was actually due to the supposed 14-year break in his murders between 1988 and 2002. His other names included the Southside Slayer, which I'll get into that in a little bit. Yep. And the 25 automatic killer, due to his use of the 25 caliber gun used to murder his victims.
Not as catchy, but I think it's more accurate description.
Yes. And while we won't go too far into his life and the history of Lonnie Franklin, I will inject some history along the way to give context and provide some light and other aspects that weren't presented in the film, just to kind of round it out.
Yeah, one of the things that this documentary did, which for a serial killer one was very refreshing and very nice, was this film is not heavily centered around him. No. He is the plot point, you could argue, but we're going to focus mostly on the people that knew him and his victims.
Yes, exactly. And so, on top of that, the reason, and from my understanding, the reason why we don't know a lot about him, and in general, black serial killers, yes, because that is also a big factor, is that Lonnie Franklin was a black man.
Yes, living in Los Angeles, California.
In the poorest section of the city. Is that he didn't talk, which all we know, like mainly from serial killers, especially Ed Kemper, who blabbed like no other, also did some audiobooks recordings.
Yes. Yeah. And now we've learned probably lied a lot.
Oh yeah, but that's the thing, is a lot of them lie to build up their hype.
Oh, for sure.
But we don't see this in people like Lonnie Franklin.
No. And it has become more recognized in this study that not everyone is a blabbermouth. Just because they don't say anything doesn't mean that they only did the few ones and you're waiting on them to tell on themselves. Yeah. But at the time that he was arrested, it wasn't quite as well thought of that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we'll get into it a little bit, everyone who's come out is after the fact, and we don't have any survivors. We have one survivor. Yes. But he has a track record that we can't really verify. We can just make assumptions of what he did based off the evidence. And that's one of the weird things about this case too that I'll get into in regards to like the police work. Yes. And one thing I like we mentioned, I do like about this is that it is so victim and community focused. Yes. Rather than being on these asshole people. Yes. And one of the things that makes this case so interesting is the community that Lonnie was in is an incredibly tight-knit neighborhood. Everyone knows everyone, even though they are all struggling. Yeah. And so that makes it kind of weird because... And we'll go into it more, but it makes it kind of an interesting documentary from the fact that the people who are finally having the confidence to talk about this weren't just like, oh yeah, I knew him once when we worked together that one time in a call center. Yeah. They talked to him every day. Yeah. Like, this was not a man who lived in his house by himself. Which is the other thing, because he worked within like a 3-block radius of his house, which is a very weird thing because there's not his hunting ground was where he lived.
Yes, which normally I think throws a lot of people off. But once the documentary goes in and starts describing A, who he was choosing, and B, what Lonnie's neighborhood really looks like, honestly it would make less sense for him to go somewhere else.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so, as the documentary starts, I do think the opening is a bit odd.
A little bit.
But interesting, because they use Google Earth to establish the opening location, which I think it makes it stand out because they're not using the standard, like, B-roll of the neighborhood or the city overall.
Which, honestly, because this is a neighborhood of Los Angeles, works really well.
Yeah.
If this was, say, somewhere out in Nebraska, I don't think it would have worked as well.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot harder for people to imagine what the neighborhood of Nebraska looks like. It's not on TV as much. It's not on movies as much. I know what the neighborhoods of LA look like. Like, every movie on this planet has portrayed them. Every TV show on this world, they're on the news plenty. I know what the neighborhood looks like. I want to know where it is. Yeah.
No, and they do a really good job of that, too, because it also... Because think about, when this came out in 2014, people are quite familiar with Google Earth.
Oh, yeah. People would have, like, this would have been a recognizable way of, like, telling your audience, like, hey... Look how close to downtown LA we are. Like, if you live in LA, you're nearby. Yeah. And so in this, they also kind of explain who Lonnie Franklin was before the arrests and what his crimes were afterwards, like how he shocked the neighborhood. Just also, they added an estimated 100 murders in 25 years. Yeah.
It seems
they kind of like threw that number in there.
Yeah, which, I mean, it seems like a lot, but... I looked it up. That's only a handful of murders a year.
Yeah,
which, I mean, compared to how many murders most people commit on average.
Yeah, I mean, the average being murderers. Yeah, the number felt high. I do kind of wish they would have elaborated a little bit of how they managed to calculate that. They kind of explain it later on in the documentary how, as they're talking to people, they explain, like, no, a lot of people have been going missing. This has been an ongoing problem, but no one was speaking up. The police weren't taking this serious, on and on and on. I would have liked I would have liked them to show their math just a little tiny bit, because, man, that 100 number doesn't add up to that 10 at the end of this film that he gets.
Well, 10 we can confirm.
10 that the police can confirm.
Yes. And from this odd opening, we do get interviews with the neighborhoods, and we get a contrasting view of who Lonnie Franklin was, as they were describing him as being nice. He was quirky with oddities. He's that weird neighborhood guy.
Yeah. But, like, everyone who talked about him, the description that they gave was strikingly different than what a lot of us have been given in true crime. And I don't necessarily think one is right or that Lonnie was different. I just think that the memory of people is different. Yeah. The memory of the people in this neighborhood's a small, like, they are a tight-knit community. Walking up to someone's house to say hi, just coming over to see what you're doing, that's normal. Yeah, and all of a sudden you have this trio of white British dudes come into your neighborhood asking about a very sensitive subject. And of course everyone's going to come out and see what the hell these guys are doing. Because in the course of the very, like, short interviews with the women of the neighborhood, Nick Broomfield is interrupted by a group of Lonnie's friends calling him a peckerwood. Yes. And for those who don't know, because like Broomfield did not know. I am not familiar with many a slang or any terms. And they do explain a little bit in the documentary. It's quickly thrown in there. And they gloss over it a little bit. It is more commonly used in gangs and the prison system, but is an ethnic slur against poor white people generally. There you go. Now you know. Yeah, because I knew Redheaded Peckerwood from that guy in Nebraska, the true crime case. The guy who courted that, like, 16-year-old girl and then murdered her family and whatnot. Yeah, that guy. Yeah, I can't remember his stupid name. But I remember his nickname was Redheaded Peckerwood. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, there's quite a few slang terms thrown into this movie. Some of them they explain, like this one briefly. A lot of them they just let go and you're on your own. Yeah. And
one thing of note is like how passionately everyone is kind of defending him at this point.
I mean, this was their neighbor.
Yeah, well...
And for a lot of them, this was their friend.
Well, they are... Well, also, like, they say stuff, and then they'll go back and rephrase it to make it less inflammatory.
Yeah. And I think we all know someone who starts off strong and then backpedals a little bit. This, especially the first trio of guys that we meet in this documentary, they are those people to a T, because... They know they say something, and they know that what they just spouted out is nonsense, and that if they had said that at home in front of their wives, that would have not have flown. Yeah,
because one thing of note that's kind of, like I said, is interesting, is that they're acting very defensively. Which is nice to see this initial This is great. This is a great initial interaction.
Definitely.
Because then we see the change and them opening up as they get more accustomed to this...
To talking to this guy.
Yeah, to this gaggle of British dudes in their South LA neighborhood.
And with their camera and boom mic.
Yeah, exactly. But another thing, like, they mention of how good he was as a dad. He would never have done that the way he raised his son. I don't think they know as much about him as they did, because...
No.
And who knows what he actually told them, because there is something that is a little indicative of what leads a lot of people to believe he was the Grim Sleeper.
Yeah.
Is that in 1975, Franklin was dishonorably discharged from the army after gang raping a 17-year-old girl in Stuttgart, West Germany. And during the rape, one of the other rapists took photographs.
Yes.
And this is a big point, because this little story, horrible in itself,
it does throw up a big red flag, doesn't it?
Yeah, and ties into, like, that aha moment of, like, we all hear about this in the serial killers, where, like, they find that moment where they get off.
Yes.
Let's rephrase that. Specifically, male serial killers, because there is a distinction that most male serial killers are sex-driven, and women are generally power or money-driven.
Yes. And...
Generalizations.
Very large generalization. The other thing that, especially for his neighbors, made it really difficult to see Lonnie as the Grim Sleeper is that their neighborhood is one where, they're strong together. They are all best friends. They're going to look out for each other. They're going to stick up for each other. But they are not a clean neighborhood. There's gun violence happening. Lonnie was known as the guy who could get you anything. And as the neighbor said, he didn't steal, but he had those stolen things.
Yeah. Well...
And on top of that, like, this is a neighborhood where being a prostitute is pretty common for a girl between the ages of 16 to 25.
Yeah.
Like...
Well, and I mean, we see that in almost all of the heavy hitters, is that on the outside they seem like good men, and that's why it was such a shock that, oh my god, this guy ate a bunch of people in his apartment.
Exactly. But I think the reason why Lonnie's neighbors specifically had such a hard time believing him, as opposed to a lot of these other serial killers that we've seen, is Lonnie's neighborhood, he didn't have to go far to already be surrounded by problems. And so if you're already surrounded by it, it's easy to say, oh, well, the problem was already there. It wasn't, he wasn't contributing to the problem.
Actually, that's a good thing you bring up, because one of his friends mentions that if there was a crack house being started down the road, Lonnie shut that shit down quickly. Yeah. So we have this, we already are forming, like, putting out, like, oh yeah, he's a great guy, but it's also, like, the underlying issues of, like, what most likely led to him, because, again, we're making a fair amount of assumptions here, because he never talked.
No, he didn't.
But it's the way people opened up about him that is very eye-opening about who he really was.
And one of the things that I really like about this documentary is that they revisit several people a couple times, which helps a lot, because this trio that we see at the beginning, they defend him like he is a best friend. They hang out every Sunday. They watch football together. They're going grilling together. They're working on cars together. And so they have an idea of what makes a good man to them. A good father is there for his son. I mean, on the outside, Lonnie was there. There's pictures of him with his son learning to ride his bike, being in the yard together.
So was BTK. I mean, and everyone was so surprised that this church-going man, this family man, was the horrible, which, by the way, this Serial Killers podcast, what pissed me off so much about it being so heavily scripted is they called the BTK, wasn't bind, torture, kill, it was blind torture, kill.
Yeah.
It's just someone reading a script and that...
so slightly
and
different.
it's so early on in it that it pissed me off so much.
Yeah, that does make a difference.
Do not recommend that one. It's so goddamn boring.
It was very dry. But yeah, it is interesting to see too that we get done talking to these gentlemen and we move on to some of the ladies of the neighborhood, and their interpretation of him is it's not that they're throwing him under the bus and be like, no, the boys have it all wrong, but they're more ready to admit, like, yeah, there's something weird about him.
Yeah, that was at the very beginning when they were before they were interrupted. Because they were saying, yeah, he was just a little odd. Yeah, we dated him a little bit here and there. We dated him a little bit, but, like, you know, he gave me the wrong vibe, so I broke it off with him. Or, like, oh, yeah, he had a temper tantrum, and I wasn't about that. Yeah, and that's the thing, too, is because we cut from the women saying he was a bit off to his friends vehemently defending him. But right after all these interactions, we get a narrative shift again, and it's brought up that there were 180 photos of missing women found in Lonnie Franklin's house. And most of them were incapacitated too. Yes. And this is part of how the storytelling of documentaries can be good or bad. Mm-hmm. They go ahead and give you that fact, even though story-wise, it's not necessarily until later on. Yeah. But it is a good tidbit of fact for you to know, because as the interviews progress, more and more people admit to him having shown them the box of photographs. Yeah. Or them being in the box of photographs for some of these ladies. Yeah. And it's not even a question of like, oh, they just don't understand or they were misrepresenting him or any of that. It gets to the point where a lot of them are backpedaling out of things, being like, oh yeah, well, that was back in the day and I didn't know what I was doing. Yeah. Because right from this then, we have that another shift as we begin... shift away from Lonnie again, because that's the thing with this one, is it likes to interject like these little facts about Lonnie as we go away, and then go right back to focusing on the victims, because, these people are victims too. Yeah, they had to live in the neighborhood with his chaos. Well, specifically, we begin the interviews of the victims, or the mothers of the victims, Laverne Peters and Diana Ware. And we're also introduced to Margaret Prescott, who is the founder of the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders. Yes. Her setting, most of this is shot of people in their street, like in front of their homes, on the street. Yeah. Just kind of wherever they found them to talk to them. Outside of a restaurant for these ones. Her in front of all of those pictures of everyone, such a good shot. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It really puts into perspective how passionate she is without having to wait later on for interviews with her that they pulled out of archive footage. Yeah. And I do want to go into her organization a little bit because I found them interesting. They were founded in the mid-'80s following an announcement of the murders of 11 women by a serial killer, and as well the police's lack of response. Yeah. Which is something that she harps on from the beginning, is that she is so pissed that no one told them that they had a serial killer in their neighborhood. And to give a little bit more framing and a little bit of context, between 1983 and 1985, there were 13 murders. But what they were called at the time originally were the Strawberry Murders. And they do mention this in the documentary. They only mentioned that originally it was called the Strawberry Murders, as strawberry was a slang term for women who sold their body for drugs. Yes. But as well, the killer in these cases was later called the Southside Slayer. And in almost all these cases, the victims were strangled and stabbed. Prescott also brought up that at this time, the LAPD seemed to give more attention to Richard Ramirez, who was operating at the time. Also known as the Night Stalker, for those who don't know. Yeah, and don't get us wrong. Also a terrible person, also deserves to be caught. Yeah. But her argument is that they spend no time in their neighborhood. And they talk about this a little bit too, or I did this in a little bit of my research, but part of it was Ramirez targeted upper scale areas. Yes, because he was trying to bring down whatever was in his fucking mind. Yeah. Psychopath he was. That's for a whole nother episode. Yes, it is. But I like how she puts it, because she explains that she truly thinks that part of the reason why this man continued to be able to do what he did for as long as he did is because he wasn't
and I quote from her, not murdering pretty little white girls with blue eyes.
Yep.
And
that is exactly what happens. And I wanted to bring this up because it's so common with similar cases regarding sex workers, and especially minority sex workers. Marcus Parks likes to refer to them. I don't know where he got the term "the lesser dead." I know he pulled it from somewhere, but I can never find the source again. I forget it and forget to write it down.
And I think the documentary that this documentary had a second term where they called it personless, like a personless crime.
Yeah,
and all it really boiled down to was, oh, well, it's not my neighborhood. It's not anyone who looks like me. It's not anyone I know.
Yeah.
That's, I'll get to it when I get to it, and the get to it is never.
Until either it's done by accident or they actually find.
Yeah.
Or they actually step up their game and kill someone of quote-unquote noticeability.
Yeah. And so her being included in this documentary really helps drive certain points home, because it is easy to get lost a little bit in some of the interviews that happen, especially at the beginning of this documentary, because there is a lot of back and forth between different groups remembering him differently.
Yeah.
She doesn't know him. She never knew him. But she does know what he did, and she knows what happened outside of that and how it affected everyone. And
one thing that I will criticize the documentary a little bit. I understand that it's focused on Lonnie Franklin.
Sure.
Is that following the initial investigation, the Southside Slayer ended up being multiple serial killers.
Yeah, I kind of wish that would have been included a little bit better.
Yeah, including Lewis Crane, Michael Hughes, Daniel Schubert, Chester Turner, and Ivan Hill, who was also known as the 60 Freeway Killer. All of these are collectively known, as well as Lonnie Franklin, as the Southside Slayer. Which is misleading to this neighborhood who's having to deal with a serial killer. Boy, and her point is good. Sure would have been nice to know that they had a whole gang of these guys running around. Well, their body count is well over 50 together. Yeah. But within this group of killings, there were 7 that were linked using a .25 caliber firearm. Yeah. So Lonnie Franklin probably had more, but he was probably in his experimental, figuring out his way of getting off. Exactly. Another thing of note, of this group of serial killers, one was a white man. The rest of them were all black men. Yeah, and they still, unfortunately, get clumped together into one person, which is not a fair way of representing them. No, and it's not fair to their victims either. No, not at all. They end up becoming a number instead of a name. Exactly. And unfortunately, I fall back on this quote quite a bit, because it is a good quote, and it is accurate. It's from Stalin. The death of one is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic. Yeah. And that's unfortunately in a lot of serial killer cases, especially ones where we don't have a true count, it becomes the unfortunate truth. Yeah. And a very interesting take that clearly was kind of in the front of their minds when they were writing how they were going to write this documentary, because they did specifically choose not to, there are numbers that they give, but the harping on the numbers is minimal. Yeah. And we spend most of our time adding people who aren't on that list. Yeah. We spend a lot of time talking to people who claim to have known him, who did know him, who are in his box of photographs. Yeah. Or talking to people who knew someone who was taken in his box and is not on that list. Yes. Because the next part, and that's interesting, because the next part of the documentary goes to where Lonnie used to work as a garbage loader. But here's the thing I like about how authentic this documentary feels. Yes. Is because he doesn't get any information from any of the guys there. They either say you missed them because they worked a different shift, or the guys who knew him are long gone. They don't even work for the company anymore. But they all know of him because he worked for that company. And the other thing that was really interesting to see is the few people that they could get a proper, hey, you want to be on film? Can we talk to you sort of interview with them, was a few guys being yeah, I knew of him. I've heard the story, but I didn't know him. Yeah. And the only people willing to truly be talking to them at this company were people who did not know him at all. Yeah. In fact, a lot of them probably are not in the neighborhood that he was patrolling or living in. And it is also interesting to note that he didn't work there temporarily, which is something we see a lot with serial killers, especially ones this prolific, is they have a hard time holding one job.
he worked there for quite a while.
Yeah, which
probably helped.
We'll get into another little bit of Lonnie's work history in a little bit. But at this point in the documentary, we are finally given the explanation of the Grim Sleeper's name, that it was given from the news, but we also get a little bit of history of what was going around the time. And a major factor was the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s. And
it hit Los Angeles hard.
And the documentary doesn't go into it too much, but I do kind of want to go into it a little bit because it was a big thing. I remember hearing about it, not understanding it because I was a kid.
And we were far away from the big city centers.
Exactly. But for younger listeners and people who aren't super familiar with it, I won't go too far into it either because it's a very complicated issue.
Oh boy.
But one of the major effects of the epidemic was that it heavily affected the African American community in lower income inner city neighborhoods due to racial segregation and discriminatory practices, one by the police and also by the real estate investors.
Yeah, and then to add on to that level of like the hole that was made for these people is the resources to get clean and to get better. Either were not offered to them or completely inaccessible. Exactly.
And one of the consequences, or many, there's a whole host of consequences, but some of them were, there was an increased homicide rates, increased fetal death, low birth weight babies, weapons and arrests charges there were an increase in those, as well as children sent to the foster care system.
Yeah.
And in fact, in doing some reading on the issue, I learned that the United States is the largest consumer of narcotics in the world, followed by Greenland and Mongolia.
Oh, Greenland, what you doing on the list?
I was a little curious about that too, but I didn't have time, and it wasn't
something
important
to Google later.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, us being on the number one spot doesn't surprise me, because even though you and I didn't grow up anywhere near where this was a huge problem, I went to, at the time, a small, private Christian school. So, like, we were not even in the, like, realm of possibility for a lot of people in, like, who's gonna be a problem, like, who's this gonna be a problem for? Not those kids.
Yeah.
But we still had, like, different groups come to our school and be like, oh no, it's really important we tell your children about not crack cocaine.
Yeah, we had the failure of the DARE program.
And not just DARE, we had police officers who would come, we had firemen who would come, and they're supposed to teach you, like, how to call 911, how to stop, drop, and roll. But at the end, they're always throwing and don't do drugs.
Yeah, and then it's like, oh, maybe I do want to do drugs. It's like, it's in Walk Hard where it's like, you don't want this. It makes you super horny all the time, and they're like, I think I want that. And then at the end, it gives you a boner. Nah, I'm good. Yeah. The only one good drug for him. Somewhat good.
Yeah, and so, like, even though we were not anywhere near, like, an area where this was considered a risk, even though, like, we grew up in places where, like, truthfully, those programs did more harm than good most of the time, like, it was still ingrained to us that, like, the easiest way to get crack cocaine was to walk outside and ask somebody. Which, unfortunately for these guys, that's how it works.
Yes. And another thing I want to mention of note, and kind of, it's part of why I am very critical of the LAPD's handling of all this, as everyone in the true crime world is.
Yes.
We understand it was a different time, but it's still shitty what they did.
Yeah.
The moniker, the Grim Sleeper, was chosen by the LA Weekly and was put into first official use by the LAPD. And guess what year, Chris? Without looking at my screen.
Oh gosh, it's gonna be so late. It's gonna be so late into his, like, killing spree. I don't even know, like 2006.
2009.
Oh no.
The year I graduated high school.
That's too late.
That was the first time the LAPD used it, but it was featured in 2008 on America's Most Wanted.
Oh good, at least they had it.
Yeah, 2008. This guy was active from the 80s till this time until they finally announced. And the reason I bring this up too is because everyone's rage and anger at the LAPD in this story
so much sense.
Is justified. Once you start looking at the dates and when, like, things were started to announce, it's like, this guy was completely off the radar for 20 plus years.
Decades.
Yeah.
Literal decades worth of killing.
It's like and also the reason I despise him so much. I am more tolerant, I guess, of the ones who open up about it, because it at least gives insight and potential help for the future.
It does feel more justified.
Yeah, it's when these motherfuckers, like, and I apologize, Mom, I do not use that word lightly. I hate him. It is him and the Golden State Killer when they
those two
become dumpy and just shut up about everything because they thought they were going to get away with it forever.
And this documentary does a really good job of, like, backboning off of this knowledge, because they don't give you this information pure blatantly. You get the sense of everything from talking to people, little tidbits here and there, a couple of clipped headlines, that sort of thing. But the next, like, I think it's the next scene, people are explaining why they didn't talk to the cops.
Well, yeah, we get into that a little bit later on in it, because that's a little bit later. But, and also, and no fault to them, but, like, Margaret Prescott doesn't go into specific dates either.
Which I think for him actually works out well.
Yes.
Because dates are really hard for people to remember.
Yeah.
But people can remember, like, what he was like in general. They can remember, like, what sort of person he was, which is so much more important.
Yeah, and this documentary is one of those ones that's informative, but it's also banking on the human emotion aspect.
Very strongly, which I think they do very well.
Yeah, and so after this, we actually learned that Lonnie worked for the LAPD as a mechanic for a little bit.
What happened about that job?
It was its actual temporary one.
Oh.
But the LAPD would not provide any comment on his time there.
Oh, surprise.
Yeah, and speaking of the LAPD, guess what their task force was called?
Oh, it's going to be something bad.
Surprisingly not.
Oh.
It is not the Hot Dog Squad.
Oh, good.
Task Force 800.
Still dumb, but not as dumb.
Yeah, it's just a clerical one. It sounds like something from a video game.
It does sound video gamey, but you know what?
It's
better than Hot Dog Squad.
Next time, if our office ever does does the Find the Clues sleuthing game.
Oh, I don't know if we'll ever be allowed to do that again.
Oh, yeah, people have ruined that one.
We went too hard. We should have gone lighter, but we didn't, because we know no bounds.
I should have. Well, I didn't join because no one wanted to join me as the Hot Dog Squad.
Yes, and also it became too competitive. We are too competitive for this.
Of course it does. We work for an architectural engineering firm. Why do they not see that? It is full of hyper-competitive people.
Yes, who also know how to use the computer better than them.
Oh yeah, that's right, because they saved one of the clues.
In the O drive, yeah. And we just Googled it. But yeah.
Yeah. Anywho. And so, at this point in the documentary, we are introduced to probably the biggest member of this whole narrative.
Yes.
And also commentary as a whole, the ex-sex worker only known as Pam.
I love Pam. I do know Pam's last name because she does credit herself in the end. So in the end credits, she is called Pam Brooks, and she is the backbone of this goddamn documentary.
Yes. And one thing I really like about her introduction is we are immediately shown her home.
Yes.
And
I love the enthusiasm that she brings to this.
Yes, because she really cares.
She cares a lot.
But this is good editing.
It is brilliant editing.
Because it's used...
I don't want to have a white British man interviewing a bunch of guys around a neighborhood. A boss woman who knows everyone already, that's who I want them to talk to.
Oh, yeah. No, and she's very open about, like, she hates pimps. Like,
yes.
And a good reason, too.
I like she's open, which is really appreciated for this documentary, because that is something that other documentaries have trouble with, is they do find someone who can tour them around, introduce them to people, help fill in some story gaps like she does, but those people generally will have an opinion and not tell you why or how.
Yeah,
Pam doesn't hold back.
No, but that's not why I thought it was good editing. The reason I thought it was good editing, showing her home first, is a way to humanify her, because oftentimes in anything related to sex work, it's easy to vilify them.
Yes, and I appreciate that as they go around, that narrative doesn't change, which is also a really smart way that they've edited this together, because she takes the time when they do meet people who are still in that profession. she takes the time to say, be safe, be out there. And, like, they don't edit her in such a way where they could have easily clipped that out.
Yeah.
They could have easily just made these girls and these women who are on the sides of the streets that they're trying to interview.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them they do, some of them they can't. They could have edited it to make it look like these women are less helpful.
Yeah.
As opposed to what's reality is they've got Pam in the back seat and there's a bunch of British guys driving her around.
Yeah, which I think she refers to them because that's the other thing. They were leery because there were other white guys in the car thinking, oh, she's an informant. She just said, no, these are my British friends.
Yeah, these are my British friends. And honestly, the fact that they're British probably got them a lot farther than if they hadn't been British.
Oh, yeah.
Because they don't hide their accents at all. As far as I can, they don't play up their Britishness at all.
Yeah.
But they're also clearly not fitting in super great.
They're not Henry Zabrowski in New Orleans harassing the tour guides of the haunted house.
No, they are not. They are polite, respectful, but very British, which honestly helps a lot because then when Pam says, hey, these are my British friends, they're making a documentary, it's a lot easier to believe that.
And part of the reason I like that they bring Pam into this is because she's one of the people who, it's not one of the friends, it's not one of the neighbors, it's not someone from outside who's concerned about the issues too. She is someone who personally knew Lonnie as a client.
Yes.
And so she's not as emotionally invested in him, but she also knew many of the people who went missing and has a rapport with girls still on the streets.
Yes. And I think that was something that really helped out this documentary and made it stand out, at least for me, as far as especially serial killer documentaries.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to find the one or two people who did come out and talk to the police, interview them. Maybe they'll tell you someone else's name. Maybe someone else will stand forward and be like, oh, yeah, let me help. Pam hunts down people throughout this whole documentary. And sometimes they're successful and they get a little tidbit. Sometimes they get an interview with somebody. But a lot of the times, it really helps you get a bit from this person as she talks to them out the window.
Yeah.
Or it explains a little better why people aren't talking about this or why people aren't coming forward about it. Because why would you? This is their everyday. Like, they didn't know this man was, like a serial killer. They just thought people were going missing. Like,
it's what happened at the time.
It's what happens, yeah. And having someone like Pam, who this affected her personally, and to see her getting her friends and neighbors and people that she has known for quite a while involved in it, hopefully also helps bring this neighborhood together even tighter.
It also brings in the largest part of the community that was affected by Lonnie's actions.
Exactly.
And also at this point, Lonnie's friends begin to crack and reflect on the oddities and open up a little bit more, which is great editing too, because this took a couple years for them to get all the information and actually do the recordings and stuff.
Yeah, and this is really smart writing for a documentary, because we did start out so strong with his friends being like, nah, it could not have been him, he was so great. And now that tune's changing just a little bit. Yeah,
and it's the thing too, because like they talk about like how kind of like sly he was with some of the stuff, where it like, I know I'm an odd character.
Sure.
And I'm very open about it. Like, the book you guys got, or Erica got me for, Christmas, the taxidermy one. The back section of it is how to taxidermy a mouse. So I have a step-by-step guide on how to do that. But I'm open about having all this stuff. And I'm not one of those, I know I throw off creepy vibes every now and then, but it's just in a different light of like, instead of like him accidentally flashing his gun, it's just like, I'm a morbid person.
Yeah, and I also think for a lot of his friends who are going back and changing their mind, the fact that they interviewed people at different times helps a lot. Because we interview at the beginning, for them, this is fresh and new. This is still stinging, this is still their neighbor, their friend, and once we've gotten to this part in the documentary, we've had a little bit more time to think about it, and they've had time to talk between themselves a little bit too. And so it's interesting too what they bring up, because they go, oh, well, they asked us to look for, like, a guy who's a womanizer and into girls, and they're like, everybody's into girls. Yeah. And to them, I see their point, but, like, it wasn't communicated to them, like, what level we're talking. To them, they're thinking, oh, well, we're already at a 10, and what the police were wanting was a 20.
Yeah.
And that communication wasn't happening. And so now that they've had time to go back, they're like, it was kind of weird that he had a box of Polaroids. That was a little strange.
Well, for some people it was, because we got the two friends who were like in on it too, and they had their own stuff.
But then I don't remember if it's here or if it's a little later. We go back to one of those friends.
Yeah, it's way later in the documentary.
We'll revisit that friend.
Yeah, because this is just them starting to, and that's good editing too, because we don't cut from he was a little bit odd to going from odd to I thought it was odd. Stacks of porn. Yeah.
It builds and builds, which is also how they experienced him. It probably did start off pretty standard, pretty normal. You're talking about girls, how much you like this girl, how much you're going to date this girl. Yeah. And then for him, it escalated, and they just didn't notice, because, you're hanging around this guy. You see him every day. Of course he's got a stack of pornos in the back. He's a dude. Yeah. He's a bro. Oh, it's getting weird now.
For context for our younger viewers, this is how we had to get through it at times. We did not have the internet, or if we did, it took 3 minutes to load a picture.
Yeah, you had to shame walk to the gas station and buy a titty magazine.
Yes. And so, from this point, we do get a little bit more about the case. Yeah. As it's mentioned, a cop that Ricky Ross was previously charged was previously charged but released. And
which is interesting, because if you go in and look at it from a lot of these side things, that man probably did do stuff.
Yeah.
But it wasn't this.
So I do want to get into that a little bit, because I use this in kind of parallel with LAPD's lack of action, as well as not sharing information, because a little bit more information on Ricky Ross. He was arrested for the murders of Judith Simpson, Cynthia Walker, LaTanya Johnson. Yes. Only after following them discovering him with drugs and a sex worker in his car, and the car had a 9mm Beretta semi-automatic in the trunk. Uh-huh. Ross was originally charged after the gun in the trunk was forensically linked to the bullets and that killed these women, but was released after an independent forensic analyst contradicted the original analysis.
It sounds fishy to me.
These murders are still unsolved.
Yeah, I bet according to them they are.
Yeah, I think we mentioned it a little bit before. I forgot to, in my editing of this outline, the LAPD did not tell the community that there was a serial killer at large until 2008.
Yeah, and at the time, word would have gotten around that they had arrested this guy, and that this is why those girls have been disappearing. Problem's over, right? Mm-hmm. Was the same press release announced when he wasn't charged? Probably not. And granted, this isn't blatant information that the documentary gives you, but this is what I'm talking about when I say I don't want a documentary to hold my hand. Yeah. I want it to have me have a question, have to pause it, Google something, or at the end be like, wait a minute, what about that guy?
I got it. A good documentary is like the old Pokemon games. Yes. Where you just had to kind of figure it out as you went instead of the new hand-holding bullshit that they are.
Yes, only I like the new Pokemon games.
They're fun. I like them, but
I also didn't grow up with Pokemon, though.
I did.
I had a card. One card.
And so from this, we also have another interesting shift, as we're informed that the production crew's not really in charge at this point, and it's more so Pam leading the investigation, which
is fine. Yeah, I don't care.
It's a nice change of pace from these stuffy old British men saying, here's what happened, here's what did he do, to her being in charge of it.
And granted, part of this is editing, part of this is just Pam, but it is also a nice visual change of pace, because when they were doing their interviews, as good, filmmakers they are, they would try to have people in shot nicely. They were trying to have people stand somewhere. They were trying to have, the narrator or the question asker just outside of frame. Pam is not about that life. Pam is in a car. We are going 20 miles an hour faster down the road than we should be, and ain't nobody wearing seatbelts.
Oh yeah, well, because they do get
get pulled over.
Not with Pam, but because this is an interesting change and shift from. Instead of talking to people in their comfortable home, they're talking to them in cars. They're talking on the street.
Yeah, Pam got them out of their comfort zone, which changed the pace of this documentary from the slow kind of standard
introductory first act.
Yeah, your standard asking questions to what feels like a fast-paced like hunt through the neighborhood to find these people to ask them these questions, which I like a lot. I liked the fast-pacedness because while it was fast-paced, Pam's questions were straight to the point. And the answers that she got back, if they weren't complete, she'd ask again and again. And that sort of interaction being left in the film really brings an authenticity to it. And it also really like ups the stakes and the understanding for the audience. Yeah.
And there's a portion of this that I actually it shows how British they are. There is live gunfire and a man running down the alley as Lonnie's friends are saying, we need to go, guys.
We should leave. We don't know who that is. We don't know why he's running.
And the Brits are just blasé about the whole thing. Just like, maybe we should stick around and see what's happening. The guy's like, dude,
no, we're leaving.
People have died in this alley for who knows what. Yes. Let's go. And they're just sitting there as more gunfire is going off, like being looky-loos.
Oh, it cracks me up because, and the people that they are with, when the gunfire goes off, their first instinct is, okay, it is time to leave. Everyone in the car. It's not even like a, hey, we have to tell you. It's a, come on, let's go. And they're just standing in the alley being like, well, if we stay here, maybe we're fine. And they're like, no, we should leave. The man just ran down the alley. We don't know who he is.
Yeah, we don't know if someone's chasing him or if he's chasing someone.
And then the cop sirens go off and eventually they're like, yeah, I guess we'll go. And the scene clips. But it is also nice that they bother to leave that in because, from an editing room standpoint, it doesn't really pertain to any of the questions. All it does is help set the scene for the neighborhood that he was in and
how it currently still is and how little has probably changed since he was... Actually, that's the whole thing is that things don't seem to have changed at all from the times he was active because he was still active in 2002.
Yeah, and the other thing that is really nice that editing-wise... I appreciate and also who they chose to include as quote unquote main characters or main interviewees is a lot of, especially the women who they interview, admit to being, well, I used to be into drugs. I'm not anymore. I am clean. And they are proud of that and they are solid on that fact. But the girls that they know, they're still in it.
Yeah.
Or, I used to be a prostitute, but I gave that up. I'm now on this other path over here. But I know people who are still in it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point to bring up because... Because
it feels like he impacted that level of people. Like, those people went, it is time for me to, do something about this. This isn't okay. But that doesn't change the neighborhood.
Yes, because here we also have a ramping up in everything that happens because we are introduced to Lonnie's son's high school girlfriend who talks about how extremely creepy he was. Yeah. And it's a good segue because instead of talking to a sex worker who, they're going to deal with a bunch of creepy men, this is someone who knew him on a different level that was on a very personal level.
Yeah, and when she explains, what level she knew him at, it wasn't like, oh, we dated for a week and I didn't like him. No, she went to family events with him. Yeah. This was getting kind of serious.
And specifically dated him, their last year of high school because he was a bad boy. And then she started learning that his dad's a bad person, and and Lonnie's son is a bad person. You don't want to be around these people.
Yeah, and I appreciate too that we've changed pace from yelling questions from people in the car to we are now having more of a sit down proper conversation, and she's pulling out albums with him in it and photos of him. And be like, this is him. This is, we were together for quite a long time. We went to funerals together. I went to family events with him. I was at his house most of the time.
Yep. And there's an interesting part of bringing this all up, too.
Yeah.
And this is why this documentary is so well edited, because now we get the real deep dive into the pornography and the state that Lonnie lived in, specifically, how he would take one of his friends who was... druggy, and would say, hey, come, let's do this. And the guy was in the car with most of the women in the photographs that went missing. And then they talk about their little club.
Uh-huh.
Swish swish club.
Yeah, quote unquote club. The other thing that was interesting, and I don't know if you picked up on this as much as I did, but from this point to the end of the documentary, most of the women who have been in his home described it as dirty.
Yes.
Filthy, dirty, disgusting. Like, they can't believe he lived like this. They can't believe he had a child in this home at one point.
Because that's another thing they bring up too. And yes, I did pick up on this a little bit. Maybe in a different way, because they talk about, like, how his wife, like, they were probably separated. But
yeah,
it brought up the two things. First, the level of the wife's knowledge and her culpability, which we don't get anything from her in this documentary.
Which I am okay with. I
am too. And they explain why they don't interview her, because they do see her.
And the British guys who cannot read a room to save their goddamn lives are like, oh, we should pull over. We should talk to her, right? And everyone in the car's like, no, she's a nice lady. This would upset her. Oh, yeah. No, I am fully aware of my English, part of my English heritage of not being able to, and maybe German too, of not being able to read a room from any of that. Yeah.
Because I mean, this, case in point, this is the shit I talk about at parties, and it's brought conversations to a dead halt. But the thing about not talking to her is I appreciate it, because she's not important to it as much so as the son.
The son is.
Because this is where we start bringing up his culpability, as he lived with his father,
he was
actively there, always in his father's business.
Yeah.
And this is where you start tracking down the nanny, who starts even painting an even darker side to the Franklins.
This poor nanny was, oh gosh, I'm so glad that she left.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yeah, they do eventually find her. And I like that we find and get to talk to her before we get to talk to the son.
Yeah.
And part of this is editing, and a lot of this is, you know, the women who agree to take these British guys around the neighborhood to hunt people down to talk to them.
Yeah.
They get a hold of her, they're talking to her, and she explains, like, yeah, you know, it started off, it's fine, not great, and then it got weird, and it got weird, and then it got too bad. Like, just went from, like, weird to straight up, nope, not okay, this is not appropriate.
Yeah.
I am leaving.
Yeah, the way she describes it sounds like it started off as a regular job, went to, like, daddy's touching nanny.
Yeah.
Maybe it could lead to something more, maybe more stability in her life too. Oh, he's trying to shove stuff up orifices.
Yeah. And, like,
for weird stuff up orifices.
And, like, she made it very clear when she's doing her interview that, like, none of this, like, was her leading him on. This was him just being creepy. And it also interested me, too, that she didn't have any redeeming things to say about the son.
No.
Which is, for a lot of nannies that we do get in touch with, or people who did babysit the kids of, like, monsters like this, a lot of them do say, oh, well, the kids were sweet. The kids were nice. He was terrible. He was a horrible creep. But, you know, I watched the kids because they're sweet. They deserve something better. She had nothing nice to say about this child.
Oh, no.
And, like, it is made more obvious later that, like, is he as bad as his dad? Not gonna say. Is he a good person? Probably not.
Nope, not at all.
No.
And I mean, maybe he's reformed. We don't know.
We don't know, because this is from 2014.
Yeah.
And it is also a one-sided argument, which is part of the dangers of documentaries. Like, these are all things coming from someone. Did they film him on a bad day? Maybe. Has he changed his ways? Yeah, maybe. Is the wife truly secretly hiding something and we all just looked it over because she's a nice lady? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's how documentaries work.
Yep. And so from this, we get our interview with the only, as quote-unquote, only known survivor, Anitra Washington, who was on her way home from a party, and he seemed like a nice man. She wasn't even a prostitute.
No, she was walking home, and he offered her a ride.
And potentially was mistaken identity, because it's mentioned that, not in the documentary, in my further readings, that she looked similar to one of the sex workers who was in the photographs.
Yes. And it's also interesting because when she talks about how looking back now, he got her in his van much too quickly. And yes, he drove a creepy van, but everyone called it a church van.
Yeah.
Which means to me that this isn't like a creepy vehicle that, like, you don't see normally run around your neighborhood. Like, he had a loud car. He had a creepy van.
Well, this is the thing. It wasn't the van he picked her up in.
No,
it was like it was some specific make of a car that wasn't even like made past like the 80s or something.
Yeah.
And it was a bright orange car too.
Yeah, and in a town full of car people,
yeah.
who, like, part of the hangout group is standing in your yard, fixing your car, washing your car, driving around town in your car. It's not weird.
The idealistic suburban experience.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
which
so, like,
I have personally witnessed your husband and Erica's husband doing just that, spending an entire day washing their cars.
Yes,
as a buddy building activity.
And I built my first car, and I can confirm that when you pull out a cool car from your garage, neighbors you don't even think you know are in your business being like, "What you doing? What year is it? How can I take a ride in it?" And you're like, "No, I don't know you. Leave."
And I apologize. I forget, and I know it's bad, but I forget that you and Erica are both car people.
They're both our cars.
All four of you are car people.
My husband plays along. He's there for the bonding experience, not the car.
Okay. Still tangentially a car person where I was like, I don't give a shit for the most part.
No, but she makes it very clear that, like, this is the neighborhood culture, even if you're not into it. Like, you've seen this car around, you've seen this guy around. It's a recognizable car. She's seen this in the neighborhood. Yeah,
it's like the people in our neighborhood or in our area that have the heavily tinted Scooby-Doo van.
We know exactly which van that is, and honestly, if they pulled over and tried to pick me up to give me a ride somewhere, I'd probably be like, yeah, I know you. No, I don't.
No.
I don't know this person at all, but I know their car.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is interesting that while she never, like, makes that full connection in the documentary, she does repeatedly say, like, he picked me up too easy.
Yeah.
Like, I made this easy for him. I should have known, but, like, she couldn't have known.
Yeah.
Because no one told her to be watching out for a creepy man picking people up.
Exactly. And that's the thing is, like, even with, like, Ted Bundy, like, talk about there's a certain level of charm to these guys where there's something about them that people let their guard down around.
Yeah, and, like, it's late at night, she wants a ride home, she's tired, this guy's nice, she's seen him around,
well,
sure.
And if I remember, it was specifically some quirk of a little phrase he said that she gave full trust to him.
Yeah, and I appreciate her blunt interview because she is one of the few people in this documentary that has been interviewed multiple times.
Yeah.
And not just by the documentary, but by news organizations, newspaper writers, the whole works have interviewed her because on paper, she's the only survivor.
And
so she's had time to think through this story, so her gut reaction isn't as emotional as everybody else's.
No. And the other thing, too, is she is an accidental victim and accidental survivor because how she escaped was he did his deed, took a picture of her, and the flash woke her up.
Yeah.
And so he freaked out. I can't remember if he actually he did. I think he shot her.
Yeah.
And then he just kind of let her go, like he let her get out.
Like he panicked and was like, bye, and left her in an alley.
And the reason she's important is because after this is when he took his supposed sleep.
Yes.
Which,
as we now probably know, is probably more like he just changed hunting grounds.
Potentially. And also, the cops staked out 3 doors down from him.
Yeah.
For weeks.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing, too, is he was so close to his house when he let her go.
Yeah.
That she kind of knew the area she was in, but she didn't know exactly which house was his. And
you can hear from her and from also some of the other interviewees who are more involved in the justice side of this, that they are frustrated that, like, now after the fact she has been interviewed to Kingdom Come and back, but at the time she really wasn't, which is frustrating because he's driving a recognizable car. She knows what that looks like. She knows what he looks like. She can describe all that really well, and she didn't get a chance to describe it to anyone who cared.
Yes, but also because shock.
Yeah, which, like, and there was no one there to say, like, hey, when you come down, like, here's a resource for you, here's someone you need to talk to, here's someone you need to get in touch with, and once you're ready, here's my card. No one gave her that.
No.
They just were like, oh, she's useless, and, like, put her back out there to fend for herself.
Yeah.
Which she is angry about because she recognizes that she's one of the only people who knew what he looked like, what his car looked like.
Yep.
But also, like, I appreciate that at no point in the documentary does she or any of the other activists attempt to put any blame on her for not bringing that forward. Because why would she? Yeah.
Well, and I think that's one thing they talk about, too, is that it's a two-part problem with everything going on at the time. Yeah, it's
definitely a two-way problem.
That, one, you don't trust the police.
And they don't trust you.
Yeah, exactly.
And no one's communicating back and forth. Like, it's the whole 9 works. It's not working either direction. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's a huge reason why he got away with it.
Yeah, and this is the part of the documentary where it's heavily brought up that the LAP did nothing in regards to it, and also that no one from them wants to actually talk to the documentary crew at all.
And I appreciate that they have some receipts, because this is a common thing in documentaries, is they say, we reached out to fill in blank here, they did not want to comment. And that's all, and they leave it at that. I appreciate this documentary went to the effort to be like, we reached out multiple times between this date, and like, it's not even like, oh, we gave them a week. They gave them years to reach back out. They repetitively tried to get in touch with them, and they got a resounding cricket noise.
Or they did get a response of, we appreciate your concern, but we will not be discussing anything in regards to this case at all.
And they even, I think it was the mayor that they tried to have an interview with to go with this piece, because there's archive footage of him and the chief of police announcing that they've caught the guy and it's all good and well. And
we get into that in a little bit.
Yes.
Just a little bit, but yes.
But I appreciate that they go ahead and give us the screen cap of what he responded to them with. And his response was, I'll talk about how crime is getting better, but not that.
Yeah.
Which sounds to me like crime is not getting better.
And also, I think it's great for framing this because we've learned of all the awful shit he's done.
Yes.
And on top of that, everyone coming forth of saying like, oh, we're realizing like maybe he wasn't really good. And like you guys bringing this up and there's a couple things popping up in the media that maybe we were wrong about this. This leads heavily into the fact and the mistrust in the police force and why I can see why his friends didn't see that he was culpable, because the police were so fucking two-faced about all of this stuff. And they hid so much information.
And this is why I say this documentary is a really good example of that style of storytelling. This is all one-sided. We didn't get anything from the police, we didn't get anything from the mayor. So as far as this documentary tells you, they did nothing.
Yeah.
Which, from this documentary's point of view, fair point. But this is one of those weird two-way streets where it's a little hard for an audience who just watches this to truly know that.
And I'm about to get into that.
Yeah.
So we do get to the accidental finding that led the LAPD to Lonnie Franklin. His son's DNA test was linked to saliva found on the breasts of the women because Lonnie liked to suck them titties.
That is a quote from the documentary.
Yes. Don't blame him, but
at the same time, if you're going to commit crime, don't suck titties.
Yeah, exactly. Or at least wipe them off.
Something. Be a gentleman.
Yeah. And so, and I'm specifically pulling this little bit from last podcast on the left, mentioning in episode 91, specifically on black serial killers, that many of these cases where the serial killers are captured, this specific case, Lonnie Franklin's case, is one of the rare ones where they are caught through pure police work.
Yes.
And
not dumb luck.
Exactly. Despite the lack of police actual work early on, they do kind of make up a little bit with this, minorly.
Yes. I mean, they put in the smallest amount of effort here.
Yeah. And, yeah, just the killer not fucking up and killing someone more important on the police's quote-unquote priority list.
Or what happens a lot with specifically serial killers like Lonnie Franklin, they turn themselves in.
Yeah.
Lonnie didn't.
Or, it's someone like Ed Kemper who turned himself in. But that's the thing that that we hear harped on over and over again. And we see this with Lonnie, too, is that there's a certain part of them that wants to be caught.
Yeah, because when they're interviewing, especially at this point and to the end, when they're interviewing, especially the male friends, they bring up the fact that they're like, do you think he wanted to get caught? Is that why you think he showed you all this? And some of the friends are like, I think so.
No, well, and here's the thing. I don't think Lonnie was wanting to be caught specifically.
I think he was pushing his boundaries.
He was more so trying to open up to the people around him that he actually cared about.
Yeah.
And I feel he probably would have told someone, and I'll get to that in a little bit because of some of the stuff Chris said, or his son Chris says about things. But what happened was in 2008, Christopher Franklin had been convicted of a felony weapons charge, and they had received a partial match. So they knew based on the match that it was either an uncle or his father. And
boy, isn't it handy that his dad's the only one hanging around.
Yes. And then an undercover cop posed as a waiter at a restaurant that Lonnie frequented, and I've heard one way or the other that the cop posed as a waiter, or they set up a fake pizza joint.
I think the cop posed as a waiter because nobody goes to a fake pizza joint in a small neighborhood.
Yes. And his DNA was taken from a discarded pizza crust, dishes, silverware, and glasses that matched the evidence, and Franklin was finally arrested July 7th, 2010. And this is why this feels so fresh, is because this is less than a decade old.
Yeah.
Also, I do want to mention his lawyer is a scummy douchebag.
Yeah.
He was delaying the case for the trial for so long because, quote unquote, well, his Fourth Amendment rights of you took this on
I watched that. Yeah.
He is such a scumbag.
His lawyer at one point tried to stall the case by making the argument that Lonnie had his rights violated when the police took his trash that he had already thrown away and put in the trash can.
Yes.
And he thought that it was breaking his rights because he expected that to be discarded with anonymity.
Yeah.
Which is bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. Fucking garbage. But one thing I do want to mention is that in the documentary, they mentioned that the LAPD missed the chance to get Lonnie Franklin's DNA evidence in 2003.
Yeah, they did.
But they leave out a very important portion. Is that at the time he was on probation, and probation officers didn't have the resources to collect DNA regularly until 2005.
Yeah, that's a point.
It is a point. If you don't have the resources, then how do you know to do it? And also, we're still kind of still accepting that DNA evidence is heavily used now.
Yes.
This is still in the maturation of that. And that's partially why they didn't have the resources for it, because it's still developing.
Yeah, and to be somewhat fair, at the time when this happened, especially earlier on in the early 2000s portion of his crimes, DNA testing was a thing. It was not as quick and ready as it is now, especially later on in this case.
Yeah, because when was the O.J. Simpson case? I'm trying to remember, because that was a big one.
It was a big one.
1994 to 1995.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is to give perspective, the O.J. Simpson case was the first high-profile case to use DNA evidence, and everyone was skeptical of this.
Yeah, I mean, this was... It's weird because now going back and looking at these cases, it's easy to have 20/20 vision and be like, wow, how dumb were they? But unfortunately, whether you like it or not, is just kind of how it was.
Yeah, same as how we caught the Golden State Killer. I mean, it's becoming the way of forensics in the future, since now we've determined that hair samples don't work.
Yeah.
Carpet samples don't work.
Finger samples aren't as reliable as we thought.
Their fingerprints are still relatively reliable. But
they're not the golden rule we thought.
Yeah,
they were.
or blood splatter.
Yeah. Oh, poor blood splatter. I always loved that idea.
The entire show of Dexter is
ruined.
Is going to be aged in a decade.
Oh, it's already gone downhill. Oh, but yeah. You know what? It'll have that old timey charm.
Hi, Charlie. And so after this point, we do have one of the two climaxes of the documentary, because this one this peaks in two different ways.
Yes.
First, we have the interview with Chris Franklin.
They finally hunt this guy down.
Yep, as well as the less publicized survivors, because there are more than one survivor.
Yeah.
In a different way.
Yes, exactly.
They're all victims.
Just not in the way the police qualified them.
Exactly. And so this also adds to one of the reasons I have no sympathy or respect in regards to the LAPD in this case, is that it's in something Chris said. He mentioned that while he was in the system, he would run into cops who were fans of his dad's work in cleaning up the streets. And
yeah, it was so gross.
And we see this shit, like
this glorification of crime.
Because, and also, I bring this up as I talk about it with a grain of salt, because Chris maybe could potentially be trying to put himself in a better light. I don't believe him to be, because
at the same time, we do have to take into account that, like, whether or not we know his dad to be a scummy man, whether or not how much he knew. In his head, this is his dad. Yeah,
because he feels guilty for putting his father in prison.
Yeah.
But I'm also more inclined to believe his story is because we see similar stuff in cases such as Robert Pickton or Robert Hansen, who was, for those who don't know who Robert Hansen was, he was the Baker Butcher, who was prolific in Alaska, and Nick Cage did a movie on him with John Cusack. Called Frozen Ground, which I watched recently. So that's why that's fresh in my head. But in all these cases, the cops turn their blind eye because they're sex workers. And for them, it's just
cleaning up the streets is how they quoted it.
It's one less person to pretend to even to give a vague shit about.
Yeah, and the other thing that was upsetting to hear from the interview with Chris was that it wasn't just the police who told him that they were, like, giving his dad and him the thumbs up for being terrible people.
Yeah.
It was other guys in his neighborhood being like, oh, your dad did, like, such good work.
Yeah.
Cleaning up all those crack dens the way he did. He didn't clean up crack dens, he murdered people.
Yeah.
That's different. Those are different activities.
And that's the thing, they don't even tell how, like, he shut it down, like...
Yeah. Shutting down can mean a couple different things, and from what we know about this guy, I doubt he went in there and politely, like, got everybody help and, broke the party up.
Yeah.
I think he probably murdered some people.
Yeah, exactly. And, I mean, it's... Again, take it with a grain of salt, but I don't think it is Chris trying to bolster himself and make him look like the good guy.
No. And the other thing that is an interesting take with Chris is it's clear that he feels like he has something he has to prove to somebody else in this neighborhood. Because when they finally do get him to come take an interview with them, it's not on the streets where he can be seen. He has to drive himself somewhere. They meet him in a parking lot, and he walks up to the car to talk to them real quick.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't want to be seen talking to them about his dad. It's clear that there are people still in this neighborhood who still don't think that this was as bad as it was.
Yeah, because it's mentioned one of Lonnie's friends gets beaten up because Chris sent some guys after him saying that he'd heard them talking to them.
Yeah, and so we don't get the full story of Chris, and for this documentary and for this film, that's okay. But it is one of those, like, pieces of salt that, like, as we have seen certain types of documentaries becoming more and more popular, it is too quick and easy to pass judgment on someone that you don't have the full knowledge about. And so Chris is that role for the most part in this documentary, which is both good and bad. It adds a level of tension. It adds a new bad guy, quote unquote, for you to be like, his son's just like him. Rah, 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 rah. But you don't know that.
Yep. And how we end the movie is with the interviews with the people who survived.
Yes, which I think was a really smart way to do it, because it brings everything back down, and it also gives us a little bit of breathing room while finishing out some of that unknown info.
Yeah, some little hope, because these are women they found through photographs, and maybe not every single one of them's a victim, because it was a dangerous time.
Yeah, and I appreciate that they were given the ability to speak for themselves and not just put a list at the end of the film.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with acknowledging people that you can't get a hold of or, are passed on. But it's nice to hear from themselves how they saw that situation and how once they realized that this was not normal or this was dangerous. it works really well. It puts a really nice perspective on this documentary and a humanizing perspective to these victims who are still unaccounted for.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, it's very emotional, and it's a great way to end the documentary, because yes. I was actually talking to my mom when she was in town last weekend, that it reminds me of, well, not specifically that. I was talking to my mom about Sally Mann, the photographer.
Oh, yeah.
And her work on Body Farm, and how she ended it with the smiling faces of the next generation.
Yeah.
Just something morbid. And also her stuff was set to be released right after September 11th happened. And so,
yeah, I mean, timing.
But it's a similar thing of this, where there are some bittersweet endings to this.
Yes.
They're not they're happy in the fact that they survived, bitter in the fact that they were a victim for just trying to survive and doing a service.
Yeah. And I appreciate that this documentary ends with them, because we had so much conflict right before them. Mm-hmm. We had our interview with Chris. We've had our clips from the police and from the mayor giving their speeches, and also from Margaret, the founder of the Black Coalition. So those all felt really hot and heated, and you felt like there was no justice.
Yeah.
And while at the end of it all, you still don't feel like justice was done, you do at least have some closure that you can hold on to.
Yes. And so last little bit that I want to bring up in regards to, I guess, somewhat defending the LAPD, because that is one thing about this documentary that I do take with a grain of salt, is some of their treatment of the LAPD. Yes, they were culpable in it.
Oh, yeah.
But this was definitely omitted from the documentary, and the fact that 180 of the photos were released by the LAPD in an effort to identify the women, but the 180 are just a small sampling of the over 1,000 photos he had, as well as hundreds of hours of videos that dated back 30 years.
Yeah, and the other thing that was kind of awkward was, I appreciate that, they did at least put some of the photos out. Mm-hmm. I think part of the reason it was left out of this documentary was there was no anonymous hotline to say, like, hey, photo A, I know her, she's still okay.
Yeah.
Or, no, I haven't seen her in so long. They wanted names, they wanted to meet with people, and if you're working as a sex worker illegally, why would you want to meet with the cops?
Yeah, exactly, because now that's putting you in danger, and as they brought it up, like, if you bring up anything sketchy to the police as a black person from that community, they're like, well, what were you doing? Were you on drugs?
Yeah,
it's
like
more of a hassle.
they're not even going to be listening to you. They're already figuring out what they can arrest you for.
But the one thing from these photos, they're able to potentially link Franklin to an additional 6 cases in 2011 that they added to his charges that were all active during his 14-year sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, at least we can rest knowing that he is dead.
Yeah, I'll get into that in just a second with what happened after the fact, because this is where the documentary ends.
Yeah, the documentary... And I think that's... It's an odd documentary because it is filmed post-arrest, but pre-conclusion.
Yeah.
And it takes itself in kind of... It's a documentary. It tries its best to be a documentary, but it at points feels more like a research and archival piece.
Here's what it's very much so like. It feels like the Paradise Lost series, where the first one is during the case, the second one is after the conviction, which the second one is the weaker of the trilogy.
Sure.
And then the third one is up to their release.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all happening almost in real time as things are unfolding.
Yeah.
And this is, like you said, it's unfolding post everything.
Yeah, and so maybe the film writers and creators will come back to this.
Yeah.
Because I have seen a couple of documentaries where it is either re-released or the future DVDs are released with an end cap card explaining the end of the case. Some of them, if there's enough, will make a whole sequel.
Yeah.
But a lot of them, you don't get anything.
Yeah. And specifically for Tales of the Grim Sleeper, it was actually shortlisted for Best Documentary Feature at the 87th Academy Awards, but was passed up for Last Days in Vienna, Finding Vivian Meyer, The Salt of the Earth, Virugna, and Citizen 4, which was the documentary on Edward Snowden, which won that year.
Of course it did. And here's what's weird to me. As someone who is both in the movie category of fandom and also the documentary fandom, I've heard of almost all of those.
Yeah.
The Tales of the Grim Sleeper wouldn't have been on my radar at the time.
No.
Like, not at all. I recently found this.
Yeah, and that was part of the reason we picked this documentary, because it was a recent one that we felt, with all the slew of true crime stuff coming out, has gone way under the radar.
Yeah, because it's good.
Yeah. Side little note, I do highly recommend Finding Vivian Meyer.
Yes.
It's a fantastic documentary about a photographer whose entire body of work was discovered after her death, and they are beautiful, just...
Oh, yeah. No, it was
street photography. It
was very good.
Great. I haven't seen any of the others on that list.
That's okay.
But outside of being shortlisted for the Academy Awards, I mean...
No one talks about it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of a shame. And I mean, it also kind of ties into the fact that they're not the big hitters. And that's the thing with almost all these black serial killers, is that they still are kind of that niche under the radar outside of the zebra killings.
Yeah, and this is also something that touches not just on this style of serial killer, but also in documentaries in general. If you want to be big, if you want to be famous, you pick a very recent, very current topic. Yeah. Like the Snowden case.
Yeah. And, I mean, this is kind of on brand for us, because I was talking with my cousin who's just started re-listening to our episodes from episode 1. But he likes us because we pick those oddball movies and, like, things that kind of fly under the radar. And this is definitely one of them.
Oh, for sure.
But not only that, so a couple of the other reasons I think this kind of flew under the radar is because this is still really in the early rumblings of the true crime boom that we currently are still in.
We're still waiting for the true crime boom to get to the point where this case is worthy of a full 2-hour-long conversation.
Yeah. And the other thing is that despite its fantastic focus on the victims, we don't see that happen often. We've harped on that. It just feels like, I think we've kind of hinted on it. What if, and I did tell you this earlier on when I first watched it, that the Grim Sleeper, or Tales of the Grim Sleeper, feels like a supplementary documentary as a whole, which falls in good for you, but for someone who's brand new to it, it feels lacking. And but I will defend the documentary crew in regards that it's lacking because of the information we have.
Exactly. And I think part of the reason, too, why this documentary specifically, while being a stellar production, didn't have the wave and impact that it probably should have. I think part of the reason is because of how we currently approach crime documentaries. And there is a movement to changing this to have it be more victim-focused. Yeah. And to have that be the center voice and conversation. But on paper, from a true crime podcast or TV show or documentary style, Lonnie Franklin's boring. Yeah, and that's exactly the thing. That's why we have like 20 different movies of Ted Bundy, and I'm tired of it. Oh, same. But I think unfortunately that's why this documentary didn't do as well as I'm hoping in the future it will, because the focus is all on the victims, which is wonderful and perfect. But for people like you or for the general audience of documentary goers, there is no second movie to come in and help tidy up any loose ends. No. You can't go on a weird rabbit dive like you can with other topics in the documentary world. Yeah. Like, this is kind of it. Well, and the other thing, too, is that this documentary, though important to Lonnie Franklin's case and the picture as a whole, it's also a much smaller portion of a much larger issue that's only hinted at slightly. It really is. And while I think that story is coming, it's coming down the pipeline, we haven't quite gotten to a place where, as a group of people who listen and consume this style of information and media, we haven't gotten to a place where we can truly have several different running conversations about that.
Yeah, because, I mean, we do have other stuff outside of this, because Lonnie Franklin is also featured in other media.
Yeah.
He's covered in a 2014 Lifetime premiered movie about the Grim Sleeper, which
yes,
it's
fine.
I haven't seen any of this stuff outside of the documentary. I wanted to keep, like, my knowledge more focused on this with the little bits of history in between. Which we know how Lifetime goes.
I mean, was it bad? No.
Yeah.
Was it a Lifetime documentary? Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just okay.
And then in 2017, Christine Pelisek
Sure.
published the book The Grim Sleeper, The Lost Women of South Central.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2019, there was an episode of Faces of Evil about Lonnie Franklin.
Yeah, like, we're getting there.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, this documentary somehow beat them all to the punchline.
Yeah, and I mean, we're getting
it's the sequel first.
Yeah.
Which isn't bad. Like, the fact that we have these interviews recorded and saved and presented in such a good way is good. Like, this is very good, but it is one of those things where it is frustrating from a documentary standpoint, because there is not a whole lot else for you to, continue understanding the circumstances around it.
Yep, and that is partially in part due to because on May 5th of 2016, May 5th of 2016, Lonnie Franklin was convicted of killing 9 women and 1 teenager, and on June 6th he was sentenced to death. Unfortunately, Lonnie Franklin died,
fortunately and unfortunately.
Yes.
Depending on how you look.
He died on March 28th of 2020 in his cell recently, with no signs of trauma, but his autopsy results have yet to be made a public record, which it's
very frustrating.
It's frustrating, and it's also hella fishy.
It is very fucking fishy.
There
is no cause of death listed. It is just said, like, as far as I can dig, because I tried to find something, like, do they think it's a heart attack? Like, all they say is, like, oh, definitely nobody shanked him. That's all that they say.
We did an autopsy. Do we know the results? Anything? We're not going to tell you.
Like, did one of y'all kill him? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the thing that's going to make specifically his case frustrating, yes, and this documentary a little bit frustrating, is that there's no definitive conclusion other than the fact that we're sure he did this and he's dead. Yeah, and that's frustrating for us as documentary watchers from the outside, but it's more frustrating because now, especially thanks to this documentary, we feel like we have a connection and a sympathy for these people who lived with him, who knew him, who were victims of him, and that doesn't feel like justice. Yeah. No, exactly, and that's exactly it. It's the same thing that's going to happen with the Golden State Killer. Yeah, probably. Because he's not going to talk, and he's fucking on death doors already. Yeah. That guy. God, the last car ride I had with my parents out to Colorado for my brother's graduation, I went on a little tangent about how disgusting of a person I think he is. Was it a Kansas long conversation? Or just like from Wichita to Colorado? It was until my parents pulled the What We Do in the Shadows psychic vampire, me feeding on them until they passed out. Okay. Yeah. But I mean, overall, I was thoroughly impressed with the focus on the community as a whole, and I went into this documentary not having done any research. Yeah. Other than, like, the little passing things I've heard, and, I mean, I don't know. At the end, I guess, Chris, would you recommend this documentary? Yes. I would highly recommend this documentary. As a fan of documentaries, I've watched a lot of bad ones. Mm-hmm. As a fan of true crime, I have listened to a lot of bad true crime podcasts, and I've seen a lot of bad true crime documentaries. This one's good. This one's really good. It doesn't feel too heavy at times. It keeps you entertained. It keeps you interested in the story. And all of these people come to you as real as possible. Yeah. And that level of documentary is something I don't find very often. Really enjoyed this one. Oh yeah, no, I mean, I've taken I've taken a bit of a break from it, but I do have a documentary in my backlog heading up that I'm actually more interested in watching now because of this, because as we've talked about, this is in the aftermath. The one I'm going to watch is Showa, which is over 9.5 hours. A long one. it uses no archival footage about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So it's all contemporary and it's all of the time. And so it's in a very similar style to The Grim Sleeper.
Yes, which is a refreshing point of view.
Yeah, so I highly recommend giving this a watch. I mean,
yeah,
do your own digging into it and come up to your own conclusions.
Definitely. This is definitely one that you'll want to have something you can, quickly type out and Google stuff as you watch, because it's gonna bring up more questions than it answers.
Yeah, exactly, which
is kind of a point of a documentary to me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. The documentary is supposed to make you curious and interested. And to an extent, some historical movies. Like, I watched Australia.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
I didn't realize... I knew the Japanese had thought about bombing Australia. I didn't realize they actually did a full-on assault on the country.
And now you know.
Yeah, exactly. And I went on a little history rabbit hole about that because I'm a history nerd. So.
Yes.
But yeah, go give Tales of the Grim Sleeper a watch. It's
currently available on Netflix, and it's easy to rent from a lot of other places.
Is it on Netflix?
It was on Netflix. I rented it from YouTube for $1.
Same here. So, I mean, it's highly accessible, and that's the great thing is, like, you don't have to go to a movie theater to see these documentaries anymore.
No, they're getting easier and easier to get a hold of, which I love.
So go out, do it, but...
do the thing.
Yeah. Anywho, this has been The Good, the Bad, and the Weird.
Thanks for listening.
Peace.